And we're live. Hey there, Courtney. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
Of course, it's my pleasure. I'm
I'm
grateful to
so
be here.
excited. I'm so excited to talk to you. I'm so excited. I came across your profile. You know what? I'm trying to even remember. There was a website I think called Psychedelic Passage, maybe, with a gentleman named Jimmy. And maybe he's on the same board as you or something like that. I'm not sure exactly, but then I cold reached out to you, and I really appreciated the fact that you got back to me and you're willing to talk, and it really means a lot. So you want to just tell me a little bit about yourself, or tell the audience a little bit about yourself, and we'll kind of dive in from there.
Sure. So, my name is Courtney Barnes. Professionally, I am an attorney who has been focused on the cannabis and psychedelics regulatory and policy reform space my entire legal career. I started in Denver, Colorado, is where I went to law school working on local policy reform in the cannabis space. That transitioned into policy reform in the psychedelic space. And, you know, I've also sort of walked a personal path with psychedelics and spirituality and personal development that has modeled how I engage in my legal practice. And if you want to take it even further back, my father was a DEA agent, actually,
Oh,
focused on the
cool.
trafficking of opium outside of Asia. So I was born overseas, and you could say that sort of drug policy is part of my karmic path.
Yeah. Wow.
But yeah, so that's a professional bio. We can start there.
Okay, that's awesome. There's so many. My imagination just lit up right now as you were describing all that. Okay, there's so many questions. First of all, how long have you been practicing law, and where are you from originally? Are you not from Denver originally?
Sure. So I was born in Bangkok, Thailand, and
Cool.
then I lived in Fort Lauderdale, Florida briefly, New Delhi, India for 4 years, and then back to Florida, then to Colorado is where I went to law school. So I started law school in 2014. I started practicing as a law clerk with a cannabis law firm in 2015. So it's been about 10 years, but I've been
Cool.
practicing as an attorney for, I guess, seven.
And how'd you decide to get into this whole space?
There are a variety of different touch points in my life or synchronicities that sort of, I think, led me there. As I mentioned, my father, DEA, so, that war on drugs was always very present. And
Yeah.
he was actually quite relaxed and cool about being a normal teenager.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
That's a
but
nice
he
way of putting
passed
it.
away of yeah, actually much less strict than my mother, who now is the most wonderful human on earth, and partially because of our journeys as well. But so cool dad, pretty very private actually, but always had that undertone of this is what his profession was, this is what his purpose was. And then I sort of had that rebellion of and curiosity of like, well, what is he talking about? But he passed away of Agent Orange related throat cancer when I was
I'm
18. And
sorry.
no, it's okay. And that was sort of right when medical cannabis was becoming at least semi acceptable dinner
Sure.
table conversation.
Yeah, of course.
And we offered it to him. My sister and I were in college, and really thought that could help. We weren't, super well versed on it, but just the fact of like edibles and, with
Sure.
speaking and pain and things. And he refused out of just the principle of illegality. He had made it that far. He didn't want to start now. And so that was a little bit of a pain point there, but also a point of curiosity. And fast forward, as I was considering where I wanted to go to law school, I met a few people at a music festival, actually,
Nice.
that worked with the National Cannabis Industry Association. And they said, if you go to law school in Colorado, you should really work for this law firm. They represent marijuana clients. And I
Wow.
assumed it was like criminal defense because I had never heard of, a representing a marijuana client in another fashion.
Yeah.
And and they said no, they help medical cannabis patients get access to cannabis in Colorado where there's a
Wow.
medical program. And I thought that was the coolest thing. And that sort of started the, fast forward track of I passed out name tags at that law firm at some event and offered myself as a free legal intern for my 2L and 3L year and and stayed there for 5 years. So it
Oh,
was a lot of sort
nice.
of different personal and professional touch points, but also very organic, and that my path sort of just led me in that direction.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's really so much fun in life when you could, when like at the time, I'm sure you had no idea what, where it's gonna go, but like how you're looking back and like things kind of like make sense and fall into place. It's much like it's fun to connect
Totally.
the dots looking back in your life and be like, oh, that's kind of why I am the way I am, or that's kind of how I ended up where I was, and you never really think about it in the moment until you're actually, done with it almost, or at least the next point in your life, and then you're like, oh, right. Like that makes sense. It's really, really cool.
Sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. It definitely, you can see a lot more connection in hindsight for sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, did you what was law school like? Did you always want to be a lawyer? Was it just, and also, actually, before you even answer that, what kind of music do you listen to that you're at this festival?
Oh, well, that has evolved over time, but maybe it was a jam band festival, so very much um like I don't even remember. Oh, it was Rootwire Music Festival, which is like a electronic kind of jam band scene.
Cool.
Yes, I'm much more of a house music girl now, but I have appreciation for all of it.
It's so funny. I actually just 2 days ago, I interviewed a guy that runs that helps produce what do you call it in Suwannee, Suwannee Halloween Festival.
Yeah, Halloween, yeah.
Halloween, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I was talking to him about his whole experience, and all jam bands kind of, and all like I guess these music people end up through Colorado at some point, because he told me that he actually lived in Aspen in the '90s for a little while, and he was actually buddies with Hunter S. Thompson, which I thought was so cool. Like that was
How
like,
cool.
whoa, like I never, like, what was he like? I was starstruck by association. It's very funny. Um,
That's a great way to put it.
yeah, but so how'd you decide to go to law school? Because when I was in I guess high school and college, I didn't, I always loved to write and I always loved to read, but I had a very, very, very low tolerance for writing and reading things that I didn't really care about. And obviously, and I was an
Sure.
English major when I was in college. I went to Binghamton in upstate New York, and and as I was getting closer to graduating, and I had less and less of an idea as to what was going on, I kept on hearing, well, you like to write and you like to read. Why don't you go to law school? And I was like, I don't know if I could, I don't know if I could stomach 3 years of things I don't necessarily have patience for.
Hmm.
What was your process like? How'd that happen?
That's interesting you say that. Again, hindsight I think is a lot more clear. I loved school. So I was a good test taker. I enjoyed performance. I was very much a person that, wanted a tangible metric of performance. So grades were
Right.
that for my parents. Like, I'm smart, look at what I can do. And actually recently I sort of came to the realization that maybe that was part of my law school drive too, was this like desire to sort of prove and assert and I I almost want to say like fight, but like defend myself and be respected
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
there was that sort of energetic there, which I didn't recognize until, probably 10 years later, where I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense, where at least linguistically, like I
Mm-hmm.
can be respected. But there was also the like drive of, I was on Vyvanse at the time. So I was on, which is like Adderall. It's a ADHD
Mm-hmm.
medicine. And so it those sort of factors aligned where I could read about anything as long as you wanted, I could,
Yeah, sure.
there was no issue with whether it was interesting or not. I was a very
You're in the
good
zone.
student. Yeah.
Right.
And so I majored in mass communications as well as in psychology. I did a psychology sort of trial internship at a clinic and thought that was very much too isolating for me. It wasn't exciting. It was, a little too scientific, I suppose. I loved the classes, but I just didn't see how the practice would be entertaining to me. And so law school was just sort of what made the most sense. And I had
Right.
a wonderful media law attorney that mentored me at University of South Florida, um and so there wasn't that much thought to it other than like I want to stay in school. This is something I'm good at. And my mom would say I've like brought it up a few times in childhood, but there wasn't like a specific goal, I would say. It was more
Right.
of just like a natural fit for continuing my education.
You know, it's so funny that you describe that you describe this whole journey like that, because I also actually had a very similar realization just a couple of years ago, but about the opposite, that I was a bad school student, and tests were very hard for me. And I kind of rejected this whole system. I'd rejected the whole system, like, because I felt like I couldn't navigate my way through it. I'm like, there's not a lot of value to it, like, who really cares? What does it really mean anyway? And all these, and I've come to notice a lot of the big realizations that happen in my life happen usually when when I'm jogging or working out. Like, you'll be like, and it'll really hit me like in the middle of nowhere. Like, I'll be like, halfway through my jog and like nowhere near home, and then like something will just like slam the brakes on my, like, physically slam the brakes on my body, and I'll be like, what just what's happening? And I just stop. And sometimes it's self realization about that. Sometimes it's something about a fear that's going on in my life at the moment. But I was just jogging, and I think that, and at the time I was actually dating a girl who she herself and her family put tremendous amount of value on, what university you graduated from and what your degree was and to what extent. And we just broken up, and so I was feeling even more rejected about that idea, that that not only was I not good at school, but it was actually kind of infiltrating into my relationship in my personal life. And I
Mm.
and then and then and then I was like, oh, that's why I never wanted to work for formal companies. That's why I never wanted to go back to school for anything, and that's why I didn't want to do that. And I was like, that makes so much sense. It's just, I'm rejecting the life that rejected me. But I guess, I guess that it's the
Yeah.
flip side of your coin, and it's like, why do I want to stick around that, as opposed to being validated by the good grades that you're getting.
Well, and I think there's always like a bigger picture too that we don't always see. You get pieces the more you do your healing work and your journey work and your like self discovery work. And that's funny you mentioned like sort of that just random insight where I've been working recently on um not preparing for an argument. And it's like I'm in this place in my life where things are so peaceful, and but I have this tendency, for example, I'll use um I got like an overcharge on my rent, and it
Hmm.
said I had like owed a late fee. And of course I just made the mistake of like checking my email at 10 at night and then seeing it and being, sort of whirling myself into a little bit of a frustration.
Sure.
And I'm negotiating renewing the lease. They had, offered me the condo to buy, and so I felt like I was in this good place. And of course I like spin this narrative of like how I'm going to protect myself, and like I've never paid late and da 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 da. And I had this like kind of aha moment of like, you don't need to do that,
Yeah.
like where did that come from? And I realized like that's been in my patterning since childhood of just this like need to protect myself, primarily like um in speech or like intellectually, as
Yeah.
like and
Sure.
and then I was like, that kind of makes a lot of sense about my desire for law school too, which was like this um feeling of wanting to be able to protect myself
Sure.
and assert my
Sure.
rights. And of course, I text the property management place at 10 at night, which I should not have done, and which is just, unnecessary, right? But my adrenaline's pumping,
I don't
and
know if I would have done anything different, by the way. I probably would have done the same
right, it
thing.
was like $80. I was like, excuse me. And she responds at night and says, oh, I'm so sorry, that was an error. I think it's just because you ordered the air filter and didn't pay the air. Like
Yeah.
there was no problem at all. And
Yeah.
so it was a beautiful moment of like that in example of like you don't need to like assume an argument. But I
Hmm.
think a lot of my childhood was very much on the defensive, and so it was kind of cool to be like, oh wow, that's gone back like a long, long time. And
It's
now
so
I'm just
cool.
working on like letting people have the benefit of the doubt.
It's so great. Isn't it amazing? Like these, like these journeys, these personal journeys that we go on, where like we find these tangible kind of flaws in our personalities, and then we realize that it's actually in our control to do something about it. Like it's
Exactly.
really
And of
such a
course,
beautiful
I'm
thing.
like, thank you so much for responding so quickly. I really appreciate, the customer
Yeah, yeah,
service, and
yeah.
I'm all kind, but I'm like, think about like now just my work has been to like try to be more conscious of where I do that and maybe, not act on it. Like let my wheels spin, but just wait and see what is actually going to happen. And most of the time,
It's usually
everyone's
fine.
just trying their best.
Yeah,
No
yeah.
one's trying to like pull one over.
I was actually
Sometimes,
talking. I
but
was
not
talking
in that
to
situation.
I was teaching. I was talking to I teach high school part time here in South Florida, and I teach in North Miami Beach. And we're and I you know and I try to keep things. I teach English, and I try to keep it relevant. I try to keep it fun and thought provoking. And there's a guy, Josh Whiteskin. I don't know if you heard of him. He was the movie Searching for Bobby Fischer is based on him, and he was this world class chess prodigy when he was like 6 years old, and or he started playing rather when he was six, and then he kind of specializes. Then he switched, I think, at 24, 25 to martial arts, and then to foiling and to surfing, and now he kind of coaches, and he realized that that most of the things that he was learning in his life through chess were actually life lessons about himself, right? So, for
Hmm.
example, like he said that his tendency with playing chess was to be a little aggressive and chaotic, and his teacher made him for 3 years just study and play defensively based on the top defensive minds, and just to kind of learn, and then you kind of like learn how to see the flaws in your personality, and then how, and instead of avoiding them, kind of embracing them and taking the time to work on them. And one of the other things
Yeah.
that he was talking about, which I guess is full circle with your story and my story, I guess, is one of the things he says is that when he was learning martial arts, that 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 you meet aggression by stepping back from the aggression, right? Like to like almost like kind of avoid it and move away, and then the aggression melts. And like sometimes, and sometimes the only way that aggression grows is by being fed with a response, right? So, like,
Yeah.
nothing is more infuriating when you're mad at someone and they just look at you and they smile and they go, "Okay, you're right. I'm really sorry." And you're like, "No, like I don't want you to be right. I don't want to be right. I want to keep on duking this out with you." And nothing like kind of makes that aggression go away than just kind of meeting it with a little bit of peace and tranquility. And I mean, I do sales otherwise for a living, and that's something I had to notice in my customers too. I used to avoid them. That never worked. Obviously, it's a pretty immature way to go about it. And sometimes, if the customer was, barking something at me that I felt was unfair, I would respond. And I started, the last, let's say 6 to 9 months, just saying like, I totally understand why you're upset. I'm really, really sorry. I'm sorry we let you down. I understand where you're coming from, and then we're gonna work to acknowledge this, like acknowledge this particular point from here on out. And
Yeah,
there's almost
especially
no
if you
other way
can
to
do it
go.
sincerely for sure. That energy is um, you know, they can feel it. So if you can really feel like you can receive feedback and listen, whether it is, yours to act on or not, I think that yeah goes a long way.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So, how would you think of Colorado relative to Florida? Where in Florida were you living when you were here?
I lived in Tallahassee, Florida, as well as
Nice.
Niceville briefly, and then I went and I lived in like Indian Rocks, actually, in uh, St. Petersburg area. So I
Oh,
spent
nice.
probably a total of 10 years or so in Florida, maybe a little longer actually.
Did you like it?
No, that's about right. You know, I had to do a lot of work around Tallahassee because I came from New Delhi, India, and the culture shock was just very real, and it was very difficult. It was a very difficult transition going from an international embassy school with all the accoutrements of being a diplomat to, middle class
What's
Southern
the what
America.
can you kind of describe what some of the differences are? Like, I'm so curious. I
Sure.
don't.
So
Yeah.
I was, one of maybe six Americans in a class of 24. We were in school with like all the children of the ambassadors from various different countries. It was incredibly diverse. The education there was, just had all sorts of creativity built into it, and it was a very advanced school. It's a really, really good school, the American Embassy School of New Delhi, India. And so I was, in this charmed life where, like, we didn't even really know what like racism was or things like that. It was
Must be
just
nice.
this beautiful, diverse melting pot uh, of students living overseas, and so when we came to Tallahassee, it was sort of the exact opposite of that. Most of all the children in my class had been born and raised there. They had established friendships. It was hard at first to kind of like find a social circle. And I remember like, trying to play club soccer, and it just was very hard to make friends initially. And you're essentially living in the South where there is not a lot of diversity, and there is a cultural history of racism and things like that. And just, even our living situation. So in India, the custom is to support the economy, and the government, if you're working for the federal government, pays for housing, and then you pay for a cook and a guard and a, housekeeper and all of these things that feel like a very charmed life but are very much part of that Indian culture.
Right.
And so coming back to America, it was like, okay, now at 10 years old, we're going to try to instill these like householder
Mhm.
values in you, which my parents didn't embody either. And it's funny to talk to my mom now, and she's like, you thought that was hard for you. Imagine how hard it was for me. And,
Oh man.
not trying
How
to,
old were your parents at that point? Or ballpark?
um,
Like, were they? Was this like totally
probably
new to them? Were they young? Were they
my
older?
father was in, well, so they lived in Bangkok, Thailand for 6 years before that. And then we had so they had help pretty much all the way from 1990 to like, no, before that, 1988 to 2002. So they had about
Wow.
like
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
long
So
time
that's
of
yeah.
living in that culture and lifestyle. And then, not soliciting pity at all, just explaining the
No. 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 Totally.
differences.
Yeah. For sure.
And so it was really hard, and it was, it put a lot more pressure on us, and it was just very foreign. And, my sister was in middle school when she came back to America, and that was even more difficult for her. So, to put a long story short, I did not like living there. And it took me a long time to kind of like not resent that part of my childhood, because I felt that it was unfair. I didn't have a choice in the
Yeah.
matter, of course.
Sure.
Um, and and a lot of things sort of became a lot more difficult in my life after that chapter ended, after we moved back to the United States. And so, now I appreciate it. It's a beautiful city, lots of green and trees, and my best friend still lives there. And so I've had that full circle moment with it. But, to be honest, it was very
It was
difficult.
tough,
And
right?
yeah.
I hear. So, so Colorado was a nice break from all that, I guess.
Yeah, and I enjoyed living in St. Petersburg for college. Like that was a beautiful place to live, like on the beach. And but Colorado was that first step of like, I'm an adult, I can pick where I go, and this is where I choose. And I and I
Was it
found
scary to
that to
move
be very
out?
true. No, I was so ready.
You were ready. You couldn't
I
wait.
was ready. I couldn't wait. I had just gotten out of my sort of college relationship, and um I was very excited about it. And I felt that way. That was how I described Denver, was like everyone that's here chose to be here. It wasn't like a product of circumstance. And I
Yeah.
found that to be very refreshing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's awesome. I actually had a very similar experience when I is that but when I moved to Seattle. I think I mentioned to you when we were on the phone the other day, but I moved to Seattle a couple of years after I graduated college, and it was actually harder for me because I don't think because I had a very very positive association with where I grew up.
Mm.
I had a great neighborhood and friends, and I was very close to my parents. But I did want to make like something new for myself, and I always felt like I was kind of trapped in this little bubble of like a life that's already been made for me and a bed that's already been made for me. and I had to move out. I wanted to move out rather, and I was terrified, and it was so hard. But I kind of forced myself to do it. My friend, I had a friend that got into grad school at University of Washington, and he was like, I don't know anyone there, and I could use someone to live with. And I said, well, I'll try it. And he's like, really? And he's like, don't. And it's funny because at the time I was a little bit more talk, less game, and these days I try to do more game, less talk. But he was like, "Don't tell me you're going to do this if you're not going to do this, dude, because I'm not gonna, I can't, I'm not going to move there and then have you bail on me." So so I really had to think about it, and I did it. And then when I got there, I mean, I'm Jewish, and 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 there was a little Jewish crowd of people that that also like very intentionally had moved there, and there was a sense among the little Jewish community that was there that like everyone that was there because they really wanted to be, and that they were looking to build something new with themselves and recreate their identity. And I mean, it's cool because that's really like the whole like history of the whole West Coast is people looking to try any kind of westward motion is just like to kind of look and re-identify ourselves and kind of take a step back from that little world that we thought we knew and see what we could come up with and what was new.
Hmm.
um and I thought, and that, that's why, like, it's so actually, it's funny because I actually haven't been back there since. And I don't know what's holding me back because I had the most amazing time. I just, there's something, like, I just have something holding me back about going back there because it was such a special and unique point in time and such a special, unique place, and everything is kind of so different now than what it was in my life that it almost feels like it's kind of like it should just like kind of be left the way it was in my associations in my head, like left as this perfect
Sure.
little place, um yeah. But I could imagine how great it was to move to Colorado and to find like-minded people like that. So you go to law school, you start working for this company, um, and you liked law school, and you enjoyed it.
I did. I did enjoy it. I was in a relationship at the time, so I didn't get super involved with like the school curriculars or anything like that, or extracurriculars, excuse me.
Hmm.
Um but I enjoyed it. I thought I had great teachers. It felt important, and I was challenged. It was a good experience for sure.
Was there a particular concentration when it came to the cannabis reform? That was there a particular concentration when you were in law school that you had to study for? Or what kind of law did you study when you were in order to transition to this kind of work?
At the time, so University of Denver was one of the first schools to offer any sort of cannabis classes. So I think there were like two courses offered. And now I think they do have a program for those who are seeking to specialize in it. But at the
Hmm.
time, there was not. So it was really just, there were a few electives, and then working with your mentors or your supervisors to say, what classes do you think would benefit me the most? And
Oh,
in my
when you're heading in that
circumstance,
direction, right? Yeah.
yeah, and in my circumstance, it was to get as much school credit as I could working as a intern. And so that's what I did. Was to the extent I had electives available, I tried to use them on externship so I could work at a law firm. And I really do think that's something to keep in mind if you are going to law school, is just the importance of getting that firm experience, because I you need it all to take the bar exam, but I do not use much of what was taught in a lot of the courses. I don't
Yeah.
litigate, so I don't use the rules of evidence. I don't really use the rules of civil procedure. Um, I thought criminal procedure and criminal law was very interesting, but it only comes up from time to time. So really having that hands-on experience, I think, was most important for me to get or to be successful in this practice. And then also, like, I think administrative law and learning how the government systems work is also an important uh,
Sure. To kind of
course
like
to
jump
take.
through bureaucracy, right? Navigate
Yeah, to
bureaucracy.
understand how laws are made and how rules are passed, and things like that, which are very integral to making changes, especially in
Sure.
cannabis and psychedelics.
I was woefully ignorant for on any of that stuff for until I'm embarrassed to tell you until like 2 or 3 weeks ago. Even how any law was passed in general. I never understood it. And I mean, kind of I have a buddy of mine that was a history and high school teacher, and so I was like, dude, I just need you to sit me down and just to explain, and just to teach me some stuff that I should know about the way our country works. And he did. It was great. But yeah, I've heard from the pretty much the consensus that I've heard from a lot of the lawyers that I've known throughout my life, and it almost doesn't make a difference whether they're lawyers for 50 years or 5 years, is that law school like kind of just teaches you a way of thinking as opposed to being
Hmm.
the practical information, and it just kind of it just changes the way that you look at information and process information. And
For sure. I think that's an accurate statement, is it teaches you how to think and write and read, um, more so than the details of what you're writing about or reading.
right, were you at one like for your internships, were you at one like at one firm the whole time, or did you bounce around from firms? How does that work?
No, so like I said, when I met the National Cannabis Industry Association event coordinators at the music festival, I actually interned with them as like a events intern, and but with a cannabis related nonprofit that was focused on advocacy and things like that. And then when I had the opportunity to work for Vicente Cedarberg, now it's called Vicente, that was a dream opportunity. And I really, probably if COVID hadn't happened, I'd still be there today.
Really?
It was a dream job, and I've grown out of it, and I'm grateful for the experience I've had since then. But I did not jump around because I knew that's where I wanted to work after law school. And at the time in 2015, there weren't a lot of law firms doing cannabis work,
Right.
especially on the regulatory and policy side. And so to get that opportunity with the firm that essentially was responsible for writing Amendment 64, which is the law that legalized cannabis in Colorado, adult use cannabis, that felt like I had been blessed with
That's so cool.
the path that
What
I
year did
wanted
that
to
happen?
be on. So that passed in 2012, but then implementation was like 2014, 2015. So when I started law school, it was just now getting to the point where um, things were starting to open, and an industry was being created.
Right. And when you say it's a dream job, can you kind of just like what about it? Was it the information that you were processing? Was it the people you were working with? What was your what were you doing there? Like what capacity were you there as a student?
It was impact work. It felt like I was actually doing things to change the world, and I was. I was able to write multiple legislative initiatives. To write like a local ordinance that is put forth to the voters, and then to see that on a ballot is a very powerful
Wow, it's
and
so
inspiring
cool.
experience. Yeah, and I had that opportunity pretty early in my career. So because I was a law clerk and I was, free labor essentially, I had the opportunity to work on some of the more like creative projects that weren't billable in the technical way.
Sure.
Um, and so once we had one successful ballot measure pass in Denver in 2016 for like social consumption cannabis lounges, then I sort of I proved my worth for working on policy as it came in the next, over the next few years. And so that was the biggest thing for me, was feeling like I was really making a change. And that's something that's always been important to me, that I think maybe I didn't know at first, but then when the opportunity arose, it's a very special way, and I think a privilege in the practice of law to be able to work on things that are impactful to people, and
Sure.
make a real difference.
Definitely. Um, and then I guess now is a good time to kind of toe the dip our toe in the water of psychedelics a little bit. What when did you first become aware of it? I'll tell you, for example, myself. The first psychedelic I took was LSD. I was 25, and I actually took it in Austin. And I was expecting for it to be like cannabis, and I was like, okay, what are you gonna watch? We're gonna put on the TV. And my friend was like, dude, we're not watching anything right now. We're going. You're not gonna be sleeping tonight. And I was like, I didn't even know what that means, But it was followed by truly one of the greatest experiences of my life, and I didn't understand for the life of me like what the stigma was, what the why it was so hush hush, why it was why it was so forbidden, and it was just so it was so strange. And I mean, actually, I mean, I guess it was a perfect time for me to be aware of it, because in the last couple of years there has been an enormous spike, in terms of research and in terms of the kind of work that you do, and and so how did you get introduced to it? What was the and you can be as vague or not, or you could tell me
Sure.
to answer, that you can answer whatever you want, however you want, and we could just go from there.
Yeah, so I had exposure to psychedelics as a teenager, from curiosity and just things like that, music festivals, etc. There it was around, but it really wasn't until I started my like intentional healing journey, which I think my legal practice helped sort of put me in the right position for, which was in my mid 20s. And we had I'd experimented prior to that date, but I was very much intellectual, very much, look at what your brain can do on different substances. It wasn't, there wasn't a lot of depth to my understanding of it.
Right.
Then in 2018, 2019, I had the opportunity to write Denver's decriminalization of psilocybin initiative, which was the first initiative in the country. It was a voter initiated ordinance to deprioritize the law enforcement of the personal use of psilocybin by adults 21 years of age and older. And that right about around that time, I was getting out of a relationship. I was sort of coming into myself of this place of like unease, of like those first sort of questions that percolate for me as an adult, which was like, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? Am I happy?
Uh-huh. Oh yeah.
Um,
Oh yeah.
and I had a girlfriend that was facilitating uh, psilocybin ceremonies. And so later down the road, that was sort of in my mind. And so it started with psilocybin. But really, my first um, truly ceremonial experience was with ayahuasca and in ibogaine, and so those were really at the end of my 20s, early
Were you taking it at the
30s.
same time?
No, 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 but I try, it's hard for me to kind of, they both had very different impacts, but it was really a slow progression of once you, I think after the first time I had sat with even psilocybin intentionally in a medicinal therapeutic setting, and then the work that presented itself personally after that, I had
Mm-hmm.
much more of a reverence and like, not, I guess, trepidation in a way, but I walked pretty slowly to sort of introduce myself to the various plant medicines that I was working to help uh, you know, decriminalize.
Sure.
And so I guess put broadly, my first true intentional psychedelic experience was with mushrooms, and um my most like profound experience was with ibogaine, which was in Mexico, at a clinic where it's legal, beyond in Cancun, Mexico. And that was like, but it
Cool.
was very sort of intuitive, organic path that led me to each one at the right time for me. I definitely didn't just like dive into all of them all at once.
Sure, sure, sure. Oh man. Okay, so I have a couple of follow-up questions. But the first one, just from a legal standpoint, um, is all it takes to what does it take to take something like psilocybin that was previously Schedule 1 and have it be decriminalized. And you said that you put it to a vote. Can you hypothetically do that with any Schedule 1 substance? How does that work?
So that's a great question. Very high level overview of drug policy law 101 would be
Mm-hmm.
that drugs, psychedelic substances are regulated primarily at the federal level, under the Federal Controlled Substances Act. Then each state has adopted its own version of its Controlled Substances Act, which is generally mirrors federal law, but there can be differences in penalties and rules and regulations regarding storage and things like that. So, drugs are regulated at the federal and state level. A
By the way, I'm sorry,
municipality,
real quickly, I'm sorry. I just discovered, and someone told me, I didn't even believe him. That same friend I told you I was telling you about how laws are made. He told me that, he goes, even if you go in a state like Colorado or Washington or Oregon, where cannabis is legal, he's like, if there's a federal agent, they could hypothetically still arrest you, even if it's legal. And I was pretty
yeah,
blown away by that idea. But he's like, listen, at the end of the day, no one's actually going to do that because it's not worth the headache, and they're trying to get real criminals, not guys smoking weed. But he goes, but hypothetically that would be the case. And I was pretty blown away by that.
it happens. I think about 97% of drug arrests happen at the state and local level, but the DEA can make arrests, and it does. And it's, although it's primarily focused on like cross-border trafficking and narcotics and the like, it can. And so, even after states legalize cannabis, there continue to be raids at the federal level, and it still happens. So it's definitely something to consider. But that's exactly the point I was alluding to, which is, federal law is the primary law of the land, and it will always win in when it's put up against local law or state law, and it goes sort of in a tiered system in that order. And so a locality cannot technically, in the technical sense, decriminalize a psychedelic or a controlled substance because they're not regulated at the local level. But what a locality can do is it can choose how to allocate its resources, and it does have enforcement discretion to decide how it wants to, prioritize the enforcement of the laws in its jurisdiction. So, what these cities are doing, and what Denver did, was it made the personal possession, use, and cultivation of psilocybin mushrooms the city's lowest law enforcement priority. And then it also prohibited the use of city funds from being used to investigate and prosecute
Wow,
individuals
so
using.
cool. So you're basically handicapping them from really doing anything about it. You're not saying it's actually legal. You're saying is we're not going. This is it's the lowest list. It's the
Yeah.
lowest on our list of priorities of things to care about, and we should care about other crime over something like psilocybin.
Yes, absolutely. So that's exactly what we're seeing. And there's now about 30 cities across the country that have passed some sort of policy reform measure related to psychedelics, starting with Denver, which was specific to psilocybin, and then followed by Oakland, which was applies to like your natural psychedelic compounds with the exclusion of peyote. So it would apply to mescaline, psilocybin, psilocin, DMT, and ibogaine.
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing that happen across the country. But you're absolutely correct. State troopers could definitely come and arrest someone, even in a place like Oakland, where, and then the DEA could do the same. Now Colorado has passed a decriminalization law at the state level. So it's not a violation of state law to grow, gather, and gift natural psychedelics, but the DEA still could enforce. So
Right,
that's
right.
something to be aware of. I think, as your friend mentioned, the DEA has bigger priorities, but it doesn't mean that if they stumbled upon you, they wouldn't do something
Sure.
about it. So you
Right.
do want to be thoughtful about the laws that apply in your jurisdiction, as some of
Could a
the penalties can
citizen
still be quite severe.
Can a citizen, let's say hypothetically, I was in Denver, let's say a couple years ago, and this decriminalization law passed, and I get a speeding ticket, and the cop finds some mushrooms in my car. right? And he writes me up a ticket for mushrooms. Can I fight that on the grounds that the priority of the ticket should have been the priority of what the cop's responsibilities were is for the speeding and the reckless driving as opposed to the ownership of or cultivation of the psilocybin?
Well, in Colorado, as I mentioned, they just passed a decriminalization law, so
Right,
states
right
can
before
decriminalize.
that happened.
Oh, sure, you could argue that, and the district attorney did drop a lot of cases that were specific to psilocybin. You can look at there's actually like a 5-year report that Denver published on its decriminalization or deprioritization measure, and you can see that like most of the cases, if not all of them, that went through to an actual court were because there were other controlled substances involved. So it's like sure you had
Right.
mushrooms, but you were also selling cocaine, you know. And I do want to reiterate that sales by people without a license is not legal anywhere. So
Sure.
if
Right.
you're selling mushrooms, there's no protection. But if you just had some in your car and you weren't under the influence of them,
Right.
so it's just possession, yeah, you would be able to, I think, make that argument.
Right, right, right. That's really cool. That's so interesting. So interesting how that works. And you did you say so were you involved in that process at all in Colorado?
I did. I wrote Denver's decriminalization initiative while I was at Vicente Cedarburg, and so I was one of the one of the lead drafters of that initiative. And then I was a little bit involved in some of the state level drafting, but the bill that I was, or the initiative that I was responsible for, did not ultimately go through. So there was a few different approaches to decriminalization that were proposed during that year in 2022.
Hmm.
Um, and so I've not been as involved at the state level policy reform, but I was very much involved at the local level.
Gotcha. 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 So cool. So amazing. It must be such a cool experience, seriously, just to be able to like I said, like what you said earlier, just to be able to have such a like a big impact and a widespread impact, and I mean, I aside from like, and and there's there's initial reaction like, hooray, it's really cool that it's decriminalized, but on the other hand, it's like you think about all the people whose lives are could have been massively affected in a potentially who's them and their families could have really been affected in a really really negative way, for something like psilocybin, and you're like you're really like, I mean, that saves them, that saves their family, it saves their relationship with one another. I mean, friends and communities. It's really cool. It's really amazing that that the consequences are far more or reach a lot further than I think even just an initial reaction or initial thought is. So it's really awesome.
Absolutely. And I think being exposed to the stories of people who have been profoundly
Mhm.
helped by the use of plant medicine, sort of opened up my perspective of, okay, well, maybe this is something I should consider seriously, and really has been critical to my healing journey. And I think honestly, looking back, having been a lawyer in that space sort of put me in the right position for me to have that experience where I may not have had it otherwise. And so it all sort of clicks together.
That's right. The stars all do align. They all do align.
Yeah,
I believe that. So can you, I mean, if you're comfortable, can you speak to the difference in experiences? I know that I've heard that ayahuasca and ibogaine is a little bit more intensive, and that's kind of actually kind of made me um, a little skeptical or hesitant to to really consider them. I know when I took LSD, it was just a regular tab, and no no puking, no anything. Just like you kind of just blink 1 minute and it's slow come on, and then after 10 hours or 8 hours, whatever it is, then you kind of just fade back. And I know that,
sure.
and I've heard that and I heard that also psilocybin tends to be much more gentle in nature, right?
It is. So I would, if I had to rank them, which they're so different, and the experience will be different for everyone, but you would I would place psilocybin as sort of the most accessible and gentle. It's also the shortest in duration. Psilocybin generally lasts 4 to 6 hours.
Wow. Right.
Ayahuasca is around like the 6 to 8 hours. It can be short, it can be longer. These are all just generalizations, but
Sure.
and then ibogaine is about like 12 hours or longer. So when
Whoa,
you think
really?
about the duration of the experience, psilocybin is the shortest experience.
And do they have the psilocybin at least? I've heard, I know from even again my own experience, there were different there's almost like a, a journey within the trip, that yeah, that people experience, like it kind of starts off pleasant and then it gets a little it's beautiful, and then you kind of get off into a little bit of like a spacier or darker place maybe, or what everyone refers to as like loss of ego almost. But does psilocybin kind of follow that guideline or trajectory, or is it just kind of just kind of shifts you into a different state of mind?
I think it's different for everyone, and you have to think about this as like these are natural living compounds, like psilocybin is from a mushroom, and like that has its own energy and its and wisdom if you want to get into it. And same with ayahuasca and ibogaine. And so it really depends on your like relationship with the substance, what you are using it for. Your intention is very important. And even if you take the like sort of more spiritual component out of that, it's like what frame of mind are you going into the process with? What
Hmm.
is there that you might be avoiding or things like that? So I like to think of these compounds all as teachers, and you don't really get to pick the curriculum. So I've had experiences that have just been gorgeous, all light, beautiful, healing, oneness. And then I've had experiences where I've unrepressed, childhood trauma and memories that I wouldn't have known were there had I not been in ceremony with that particular plant.
Wow.
And so you really just have to go into it with an open mind and an open heart and the right sort of intention to learn, and then see what comes up for you. The medicine will never, give you anything you can't handle, but there is great importance in preparation when you're beginning to work with these substances because they are very powerful, and if you're not in right relationship or you don't have the support and the tools and most importantly the integration protocols, so the after
Right.
procedure, it can bring up a lot of difficult stuff that may be complicated to handle if you're not prepared for it. And so that,
How do you
but
prepare?
it's hard to predict a situation.
How did
um
you personally prepare, rather? Like,
sure.
what did
So
you
it's,
do? Yeah.
I think there's several different ways depending on the medicine. Whomever is going to be guiding the experience, your facilitator, they usually will have a protocol for preparation, and that generally should include medical intake. What prescriptions are you taking? What is your psychiatric history? What is your health? Ibogaine can be difficult on the heart, and so you really want to get heart monitoring and to do an analysis to make sure you're healthy enough to take it. If your facilitator is not asking those questions, that's a red flag, because
Right.
these are medicines and they need to know your medical history and your um, psychological history to make a good informed choice for you. So I think that's like number one is the health qualifications. Are you taking medications you need to taper off of? Are you in a place where your body will be able to receive the medicine in a safe way? Then
Cool.
you have the like intention setting, which is, why am I taking this medicine? And there's arguments for recreation and fun, and like, that can be very healing too, but you want to get as clear as you can on, what would I like out of this experience, whether it's heart opening, whether it's clarity on a relationship or a job, whether it's, just detoxification. That will sort of steer your preparation, and your intentions can change. Don't try to get too rigid with it, but I think it's very important to know why you're choosing this. And then depending on the compound, there will be like a purification process. So ayahuasca generally requires a dieta to be followed where you're sort of purifying your body of dense substances like pork and like a lot of processed foods, like things that will um, make it harder for the medicine to like flow and work through your body and will and provide a more difficult experience.
That's why people say
So there's
a
also
lot of people puke when they take it initially, right?
yes, so it doesn't have to happen, but it can happen, especially if you have like repressed emotions or stuck stuff that is blocking movement. It can
Mm-hmm.
happen, and also like I think if you're not following a good diet, it's more likely to happen. And so it's all about like preparing your body, mind, and spirit to receive the medicine. And then it's like your content and like you know cleaning out your consciousness to the extent you can prior to ceremony. So making sure you're not consuming like a lot of like violent movies or media, watch your intake of the news, watch the music you're listening to. Like, are you listening to high vibrational information, or are you, sort of filling your consciousness with things that may not be helpful to you in ceremony? And so it's really just like a big clean house of preparation, and that includes like health, intention, and then purification to the extent you can. Um, and then, the after work is, I think, even more, if not equally important, which is what you're going to do with the experience that you've had on the medicine. And I think we're just now getting to a point in the movement where there's increasing focus on how important it is to have an integration plan for any ceremony you're going to sit in.
So, but you have to I guess you have to come up with this plan after the experience when you come up with whatever new enlightenment or understanding that you experienced, right? Meaning,
Yes and no. Like
like, how do you plan for it?
a lot of the more sophisticated programs that are available in places um, generally where it's legal are will have at least 4 weeks, but 6 weeks or longer programs that you'll follow. And you really, if you're going to sit with psychedelics for the use of healing trauma or other indications, health or otherwise, you really want to work with someone that's going to put you on a program. That's not just going to be like, okay, now you're finished, see you later. Because the
Right.
care afterwards is so important. Really, you're going to be opening yourself up to both external information, but also a lot of internal information. And if you don't have the support systems in place and the care in place, it can be a very difficult process. So at a minimum, it's, avoiding alcohol and stimulants and like other things like that can impact the nervous system afterwards. Making sure you have a supportive community in place. That might not be your family and friends, depending on, why
Sure.
you're seeking the medicine. It could be the people that your cohort, the people that you are going to sit in ceremony with. And I think if you don't have that in your natural community of people that are going to be supportive of the changes that might be occurring after your experience, then you want to make sure you're choosing a program that will provide a community for you. So that way you have people to talk to about your experience, because that's so important to have someone that can be a non-judgmental listener
Hmm.
and who will support the changes that you're going through, because a lot of times it can result in big changes, especially if you haven't been living in alignment with your true self. So you just want to be prepared that this could have an impact on you. And yoga, meditation is so important. Journaling, I think, is huge,
I love
because
journaling. Do you journal?
yeah, I do journal. And I think, yes, I journal. I try to do it as often as I can. And especially after sitting in ceremony, I think it's critical, because there's so much there that,
Got to
maybe doesn't
process.
make sense right now. But
Yeah.
yeah, at least you want to make sure you're getting it out of your field and into something that you can look at later and that you can um, use to have those emotional releases or revelations.
Yeah, some of the, I mean, throughout so I mean, I started writing recreationally, I guess, when I got into college, And then somewhere along the line, I happen to be, I'm very grateful for this, although, there's obviously, pros and cons to it. I'm a very emotionally aware and in tune person, and I feel extremely, I feel, I feel strongly, but I'm also very nuanced in what I'm feeling. So I don't confuse, if I'm anxious about a breakup, or I'm anxious about about the amount of money I made this month. I'm pretty good at identifying what the differences are, right? And there's actually times where, but sometimes it takes time to kind of like stew up to the, bubble up to the front of to my consciousness. And I found that writing really helps me bring it forward, and will help it emerge in a faster, more efficient manner. So I
Sure.
write letters to myself that always start "Dear Me," whatever date it is, and then and I'm sure you could maybe understand this. It's almost like a transcendent experience where my fingers type things that my mouth or my brain wouldn't even be comfortable admitting or saying out, admitting or thinking about,
Sure.
and I'd be like, dear me, I'm feeling really down lately, and I can't put my finger on, I can't put my finger on why. And like maybe it's because I feel like I haven't been, maybe and maybe because I feel disappointed in myself and the amount of effort I'm putting into my relationship. And I'd be like, whoa, like I had no idea that's what it was going to be, and then I say, okay, and then once that happens, examples start popping up, and then I force myself to be very raw, and then I force myself to end it with not necessarily an answer, but just an admission that this is all part of the journey and everything's going to turn out okay. And um and I try not to look back on the letters for I'm very good about it. I try not to look back on them for anywhere from 6 months to a couple of years. There's some that I've written in 2020, 2021, 2022 that I haven't even looked at yet. And but the ones that I have, it's so mind-boggling to just see, what was occupying my head, in such an intense way, and how irrelevant it is almost to my life now. And when I say irrelevant, I don't mean that it wasn't an important part of it, but it doesn't affect, like I'm like, oh right, I built on that already for so many years that I'm looking way back the rearview mirror at this point.
Absolutely. I think that's all great. That's all great perspective when it comes to journaling, and it can be different for everyone, but it is very valuable, and I find that I just read my entries from I think last February when I was going through a heartbreak, and that you could hear the cheerleader in me, but I was very, very sad. And it's like so beautiful because after a year of really intentional self work and development, I can read those entries and just have so much love for that version of myself who knew it would get better but wasn't sure how.
Mm-hmm.
And I think too, for those realizations as well, of just like letting yourself write. And it's like if you can't be transparent and honest and vulnerable with yourself, then that's going to be very difficult to be mirrored to you in a relationship. And so I find that the practice of writing as raw and as vulnerable and as truthfully as you can is a very, very powerful tool.
Yeah, it might have been the single most emotionally helpful tools. And like I learned it, from that. But I was so fortunate. I had a professor in college, and it was the first class I took. That's what encouraged me to become an English creative writing major. And he said two things that first day that really struck me. Number one was, he's like, in order to be a great writer, you have to love at least 50, preferably 100 things more than writing. He's like, otherwise you have nothing to talk about, you have nothing to write about. You have no, you
Huh.
can't capture the detail and the love for life. If you want to be a creative writer and you want to be a great storyteller, he's like, you have to love so many things more, because that's all the great writing comes from, all the details and the appreciation and everything else other than writing. Writing is just a way of capturing it. And I was like, that blew my mind. So my first
That's
collection of
beautiful.
poetry, yeah, my first collection of poetry is called 50 Things More, because it's everything I liked more than writing. And and the second thing was, and he told us about how, his life, it was in a very he grew up in, like, the very, very blue collar part of New Jersey. And his dad was, you know, a factory worker and a boxer. And both his parents were dead before he was 18. And he was living in the streets and working in the factories. And he's like, and the only way that we could really, you know, like kind of go on through life and like even be happy a little bit was by writing about how grim everything was, but with a little bit of sense of humor. So he's like, he's like, I love the pile of dirt that sits outside my front porch every day, or, like I've never been a clean eater and I always have like ketchup on my, on the back of my hands or stuck somewhere in my beard. And like that kind of rawness and openness and honesty was like, it captured me immediately. And I said, it's such a real way of living. It's so beautiful. And I think that kind of, and I think that, I think that especially, it helps people process. It helps me process for sure. And I actually have not. I tried writing when I was taking LSD, and I wasn't ready for it. Like what I was experiencing, what I was processing, I wasn't ready for, and I didn't really, I didn't do it in a very ceremonial setting, of course, but I like to think that I was pretty intentional about it, and and I still haven't, but I did understand, like I did have a new perspective that I did realize was going to fade pretty quickly if I didn't do something to reinforce it.
Mm.
It's like striking a match, and it flares up, and then you got to bring it to something, because otherwise it just dies back down again. You got to light another candle with it, and so that initial striking is really beautiful and really wonderful. But the way to really kind of change and the way to really grow and evolve is to you know is to use it to light something as opposed to just watching it
Hmm.
fizzle out.
And I think that's a great analogy, not just for writing, but also for integration, which is like you will have this burst of clarity and information and this window afterwards where you will have more neuroplasticity to learn and to create. But you have to use that, and you have to use it for good. You have to use it for building healthy habits, for making the changes you know you need to make. And I think, yeah, having a writing practice to assist and complement that time is very important.
Yeah, definitely. I couldn't agree more. So you left Colorado. You left Colorado and came to Texas. Is from one to the next? You went from Colorado to Austin.
So no, I actually was in LA for a little while. I went to LA off and on. I did some traveling and work remote traveling, and then was in LA for like a total of, I guess it was a 2 year period.
How'd you like
And
it?
then from there I moved to Austin. I liked it. I didn't love it. It was paired with the most difficult sort of time of my life, of
Sure.
really when I had my spiritual awakening and sort of opened my karmic box for the lifetime of just all of the work and pain and emotional processing that I had never been taught to do and that I had been disassociating from, um, sort of came to me in the middle of my stay there. And so it was tough because I went from being this sort of lawyer party girl, in my 20s, to really having to completely focus on myself and my healing and how I was showing up in the world, which was not in alignment with my true nature at the time. And so I didn't get to be as extroverted and
Right.
social as I would have liked for that part of my life. I kind of got put in this like deep dark night of the soul. And so
How'd you navigate it? Was it writing? Was it talking? Was it how'd you navigate it?
it was,
If you don't
oh
mind
my
me,
gosh, a little bit of
yeah,
everything.
yeah.
And I think the universe sort of gives you things when you're ready, but you don't know that you're ready. And so I actually was working on a client. I had just gone through like another heartbreak, and I was kind of hitting this point of like, what is up with me in relationships? Like, I was in two very long relationships in undergrad and college. And
Hmm.
then once I got out of that big relationship, which was like, I guess 6 years or so, nothing worked. And it was like, and maybe partially because I was in LA and I wasn't supposed to be there, like all of those things. But like,
Sure.
I kind of hit a point in my like singlehood where I was like, what is going on? Like, why is this not working for me? And so,
Hmm.
this sort of self discovery component started, and I was actually working with a nonprofit who was looking at having the DEA sort of, or having us reanalyze whether ibogaine was scheduled properly, because it really wasn't.
Right.
And I had never really thought much about ibogaine, which is a psychedelic that derives from a like shrub in Gabon, Africa, and so there wasn't a lot of exposure. It's not really used recreationally. It's not something you would just do on your own. And I had a friend who was opening a clinic for ibogaine in Mexico, where it is legal. And so I called her and just said, I'd love to talk to you about this. There's some stuff online, but not a lot. And she said, if you can get down here next Thursday, we have a spot.
No
And all you
way.
have to do is like,
Show up.
pass the medical intake and
Oh,
show
that
up.
too.
And
Right.
it felt like this very, at the time I wasn't spiritual, but I believed in like the planets and astrology. There was always stuff, it was always there, but I didn't know how to process it because I was never taught um, that. But it felt like I had to go. And so I went and had not done proper preparation. I sort of thought it would be like every other psychedelic experience, which up until that point had been very positive for me. I had had like a little bit of sadness come up before, but it felt very therapeutic. It was all very manageable. Um and I wrote, I tried to prepare the best I could. I probably wrote 10 pages of things I wanted help with.
Wow.
And when I got into it, it was it essentially showed me all of my pain, and a lot of it was familial, a lot of it was from very, very early childhood, and it was this sense of, what was your first experience of rejection? And that's sort of what I had been working through with the last person I was dating casually. And I began like showed me like how young that started in me,
Wow.
and
Wow.
really just like a lot of familial things that I had like disassociated from, that I had totally blocked out, that I wouldn't have been able to answer. And it rocked me in a way where the information that was provided was so of such like depth and clarity, and just it was the first substance I had taken where I was like, that was not a drug. Like, that level of information, like that was not just a drug. That
What'd you think it
was
was?
God.
Oh, yeah.
God. It was like my first experience of God. It was the first experience of my soul, of like awakening to my soul,
Wow.
which I had
That's
no concept of,
wow.
and I had like been a good person. I had a pretty good moral compass, but like very much on earth, very much lacking meaning to a lot of this, to a lot of my life experiences. And it like awoke me to my inner child, and we scared each other like,
Sure.
and just the connectivity, but just the intelligence was so striking, and a little dark but important for me, that I could never be the same. I was like, that there is a God.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
And in that same way, it sort of opened my work, which was like my big cry for help, was like, what is wrong with me, essentially. And its answer was, nothing is wrong with you. Here are all the pieces of your past that have made you the way you are. And then it became my job, consciously, without, you know, psychedelics, to repair those sort of fractures in my identity and self and
Wow.
soul, which required like, sobriety. It required really difficult conversations with my family. It required like periods of not talking to particular family members, and then ultimately healing that. So it opened up a lot of pain that I had been repressing, and sort of had to like re-experience in real life in the way that I could with now with this like greater level of consciousness. And it's like once you sort of have that awakening, you can stall and you can, revisit old stuff, but you can't really go backwards, at least not for long.
I
The
was gonna
universe really
ask,
won't
how
let
do
it
you even like
happen.
how could I was gonna ask, like, how could you go back from something like that? You know, that's but like also yeah, when that was over, were you relieved or were you like, whoa, or were you like what or were you just like almost shattered?
I
I've been
was pretty
shattered in this
shattered.
yeah, shattered, right?
Yeah, I because I didn't have the tools, and now I have the tools, and I would do it again, and I would, you know, send people there, and I continue to advocate for it. But it was almost, I would say, a dark year, and then like a 2 year period of sort of clearing out all that karma and all that pain and all that suffering and like rebuilding, reparenting, and like nourishing myself in a way where I had just been so external for so long. And then I think there's a great degree of patience that's required because it's like, okay, you did not process a single heartbreaker, like even my father dying, your whole life. And now it's like, okay, I'm like, all right, well, it's been 6 months. I'm ready to like be healed now. And it's like, well, you're just not,
Yeah.
like there's a lot more emotion to release and a lot more like patience. And I think that was my whole life was like rushing through things, trying to get to the next step. And this past 2 years has been a very much like slowing down of like giving my inner child and myself the time and attention that is required to like truly heal that neglect that I unknowingly, was a part of throughout my whole childhood and young adult life. So I think there are incredible programs now that make it a lot more approachable, and that have good paths and guidance and support that I didn't necessarily set myself up with. But it was an incredibly difficult 2 years that I think like paved the way for now this like the brightest, most beautiful period of my life,
Wow. I
because
hope it
I
keeps on getting better and better
took
too.
myself out of the game. Yeah, it
Yeah.
is. It's gorgeous. I mean, I am so immeasurably blessed, and now I can receive it because I've let go of all of those emotions that prevented me from feeling worthy and feeling lovable and, you know, feeling like I had to like prove myself. And so it is possible and it's so worth it, but it takes time. And I think that's like, you know, if I hadn't done anything after I began, I would be in a much worse place. And it wasn't because I finally like asked for help, um, that I was able to like start integrating. And I think that's so important to just, set yourself up with like, if I'm using ibogaine to get off of addiction, then like I need to probably not go hang out with all the people that I was hanging out with before I got
Yeah.
help, like or relationships and jobs and just the people you surround yourself with. So it's a hero's journey for sure, but absolutely worth it.
I mean, we don't know each other at all, other than this, but it's very emotional to hear about this, and it's and it's weird to say that I feel proud to hear something like this, but I just know so many people
Thank
like
you.
I know so many people that are that from kids to adulthood to the later part of their lives, and there are parts of them that like you can just see aren't them that just take hold of them and that they never acknowledge, and like and at some point we kind of people just kind of figure like, okay, I just am, I am who I am, and like that's it. And if I'm miserable because of this, or if I snap because of this, or if I'm afraid because of this, then like that's just who I am, and and it's so important that like that we know that it doesn't have to be the case. It doesn't, like, you don't have to be
Mm-hmm.
stuck in that, and you could do the work, and I think that, and again, like you talked a little bit, you literally just mentioned the word a couple of times, but neuroplasticity, just, as we get older, our brains are less and less plastic, and, it makes it harder and harder to change. And, there are things obviously that you can do, even aside from psychedelics, but including them, listening to new music or taking new routes that you haven't, like you haven't walked or driven before, apparently is excellent for it, and healthier
Yeah.
habits to kind of, dive into. um, but it's so, it's so beautiful every time I hear someone kind of, you know look their demons and their ghosts just, in the eyes, and say, I know who you are, I know what you are, and I know why you're here, and it's time for you to go now, and uh,
Yeah, or to give it love. And I think, whether you're spiritual or not, but if you're trying to find some sort of purpose on this life, which can be quite confusing and chaotic on Earth, is like we're here to grow and evolve,
yeah,
and to be the most expressed and empowered versions of ourselves, if nothing else, even if it's just for this one time, if that's what you believe.
yeah,
And if there's a potential for more, don't you want to get as much learning done as you can in this one so you won't have to do it again if that's something you
yeah,
believe?
yeah,
And so I think if you can approach life as like Earth School, then you can have a little more grace with some of the life experiences that are more difficult and painful, which is just there's something here to learn from and grow from. And I think you're absolutely right with the, sort of these just accepted traits about ourselves that are not empowering, which is, I whether it's jealousy or insecurity or fear and things like that, of just having an open mind that, maybe there is another way. And I think I've had that in relationships where I thought, this is me and I'm showing up the way I am. And if you don't love me, then you're not meant for me. But in those past relationships, like I really wasn't an embodied version of myself,
yeah,
And so,
yeah.
and thank goodness that didn't work out, because then I'd be with someone who
Who's
I'd be
compatible with that other
with
side
someone.
of you that's not you, right?
Yes, exactly, right. With all that pain I was carrying around and letting, seep out into things. And so, just I think, yeah, having that perspective of this is a lifetime's work, and we're here to learn, not just in our profession and in school, but in every way. And I find that to be to provide me with a little more grace and a little more patience and having things, you know, that I want when I want them.
So you've become a lot more spiritual in the last bunch of years,
Absolutely.
right?
I did not I thought like I was one of those people that was of the belief like how can there be a god if there's this much pain in the world? Like why would this happen to me if there was this like almighty creator and I'm, being a good girl to the extent I can. It didn't make sense. And it wasn't really until my work with psychedelics and especially ibogaine, but also ayahuasca and others, to feel that like just sense of being held in the like the meaning to life that we have, which if you're asking me personally is that it is it is enlightenment, it is to transcend all of the qualities of our ego that keep us separate, that make us feel
Yeah.
divided, that make us feel scared and fear. And I do believe in reincarnation, which I didn't always believe in.
Uh-huh.
And then I think that helps me in a lot of ways, if nothing else, to be a better person today, to know that like it's my responsibility as Courtney to learn and grow and transcend as much as I can while I'm here. And I think you could take spirituality out of that and still make it a solid approach to life. But for me, having that knowing and faith and trust in a higher power that like these experiences were not here to punish me, but were here because they were wounding and pain that I needed to transcend, and that you can transcend, that like
Yes,
it
it's an
doesn't, you
opportunity.
don't have to
It's an
repeat the same
opportunity.
patterns. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a lesson. Makes it a lot more easy. It makes it a lot easier to sort of take on life's challenges and obstacles.
Yeah, I've recently, I've only realized that, recently, and and I know there's going to be a very, very long, long, strange trip. But I've noticed, I've realized in recent years that most of the things dis, that I'm primarily driven by fear, and the fear that I can't handle the unknown and what's going to happen, and so I keep on trying to. So I'm trying. So I've been. I mean, I think half consciously and half unconsciously been trying to tackle experiences and aspects of life that that I could kind of tackle one fear at a time and show myself that that I don't have to be bound by this, and that that fear doesn't have to be a rule and doesn't have to be who I am. And it could be, I c- I it's almost, I feel like it's a sweater and I have to just like pull it off, and I'm taking one arm out and I'm taking the other arm out and I'm trying to like get it, I'm trying to get it off my off my neck, but it's been it's been around for so long that, like, it's kind of shrunk on me a little bit. And so, it's taking a lot of work. But I'm actually, my wife's expecting our second kid, and there's a lot of concern, fear about that as well. And I was ac- you know and I've been thinking about ways to kind of intentionally handle it, and to kind of face it, and face it head on. But
Yeah. And
it's
again, it's like it's a that's the work of a lifetime, right? Or potentially multiple ones. So it's like, where can you show up for yourself? Where
hmm
can you take on that
yeah,
discomfort? And whether it's yoga or, an acting class, even though you're, not going to go apply for Broadway, but how can you stretch yourself in little healthy ways? And I think the more that you do that, the more like adaptable you are to the bigger things too.
yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. Okay, well, I'm gonna let you go with that. I think, if that's okay. I think
Sure.
that
Of course.
was a really, really, really beautiful podcast and really beautiful story, and I think it was really nice. I think, maybe we'll do another episode that's a little bit more on the legal side and a little bit more about what you do in terms of work, because I'm still super curious about that. I know we touched on that, but I'm so happy that the way that this unraveled and the way that we kind of just like, kept on pulling at strands and strings. And and I think that this is going to have a really, really, really positive impact on the world. And I think that your story is beautiful, and I think that you should. I think that, again, I'm, from one stranger to the next, I'm really, really proud, and it's really, really impressive to hear, the work you've done and where you're heading. And I wish you really the best of luck, in continuing to, discover and love and and improve yourself. And I think it's really, really beautiful.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on your expanding family. This was a
Thank
pleasure. It's
you.
always it's always such a blessing when the conversation flows organically, and I'm grateful I got to learn about you and your story a little bit. And yes, happy to come back and
Yeah, and
chat
I'll
laws and
follow up and we'll do this
regulations.
again. This was tons of fun. Thank you so much, Courtney. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
Have a great day. We'll talk soon.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.